So lately I've been kind of going down a rabbit hole of sorts. I've been really enjoying doing a little bit of wildlife photography. Wildlife photography is something that I've done a little bit in the past, but I've never taken it very seriously. And for some reason, I just found myself really, I don't know, inspired to shoot more wildlife photography. Shooting wildlife is so much different, but it's such a great companion to landscape photography because, first of all, it's something that you can do during those kind of middle hours, and it's not as light dependent. It's still fairly light dependent, but you can really do it in multiple different types of lighting situations that doesn't necessarily work very well for landscape photography. So nice clear day, not so great for the grand landscape, but it works really well for wildlife. So one of the cool things about switching to Canon is that the RF adapter works really well, and it makes some of those older lenses on the EF system, it kind of breathes life into them. And one of the first things that I did was start searching for a wildlife-centered lens, and I found this guy. So this is something that I've always wanted to own. This is a 500 millimeter f4 lens. And the crazy thing is the eye autofocus and all the tracking works really well. And this lens was released in 1999. So this is what, a 23-year-old, 24-year-old lens. And it works awesome on my R5. Granted, it is heavy. I could do bicep curls with this, but it's quite sharp. Here are some of the images that I've captured with it so far. I found it to be difficult to handhold. You can do it for a little bit, but you definitely need a monopod or a gimbal or something to shoot for extended periods of time with it. But the optics on it are excellent. The image stabilization, the motors back then, this is the first version of their image stabilizer, and you can tell it's loud, doesn't work really well, but when you turn it off, you know, most of the time when you're shooting wildlife photography anyways, you're using really fast shutter speeds. So a lot of times I shoot with it off. Combined with the IBIS, the in-camera stabilization, I found it really awesome. So really happy with this purchase. It's allowed me to shoot quite a bit of wildlife photography lately. And in today's video, I wanted to actually go over how I go about post-processing some of those wildlife type shots. It's very different in a lot of ways than a landscape image. It's got different sets of problems. And it's really fun to approach those wildlife images as a landscape photographer because the post-processing side of things is so different. And if you take that same kind of workflow that you would apply to a landscape image and apply it to a wildlife image, you can come away with some pretty cool results. And there's a lot of really cool possibilities with wildlife photography. So I'm going to share that with you guys now. So one of the first steps in any wildlife photographer's workflow is to go through and cull their images. And oftentimes that's probably the most tedious and the most difficult because you're shooting in high speed bursts, which means you're coming away with a lot of photos. And then a lot of times you get these moments that are very similar and you kind of have to determine which moment you like best, because wildlife photography for me is all about the moment, especially when you're photographing action. So take this sequence, for example. We have this juvenile bald eagle fishing, and as we scroll through our images here, you can see that each moment has its own thing going on. Do we like this moment here where the wings are spread and we have this really cool spray coming off the fish? Is it critically sharp? That's the other thing that you always have to check in wildlife photography, because a lot of times your favorite moment isn't necessarily when the autofocus was really nailing focus. Here, all of these seem to be pretty critically sharp. And then you have to decide, okay, which pose do we like best with the wings? I like to do this culling process pretty quickly after a shoot. So in this case, I went through and I culled my images the night that I shot all of these. It was still fresh in my mind. I wasn't very sentimentally attached to anything, so it was really easy for me to go through and to pick my keepers. So the thing that I look for as a landscape photographer is what colors are present, or which colors could be present. Because one of the key parts of any landscape image is to have that nice color separation. And I was shooting, these are all taken in the wintertime and there's lots of snow around, and I really like that kind of cold feeling. But I want there to be warm tones to kind of balance those cool tones. That way you have this warm to cool color temperature contrast between the eagle and the background. And we can also use that to our advantage to draw our eye even more to our eagle. So between these two images, we have this one and this one. And the thing that I like more about this particular shot is the fact that we can see more of the warm, tones on the feather detail. The feather detail and the patterns in the feathers I really like. And color contrast wise, it contrasts well against the background, especially if we kind of emphasize the cold tones of that background. So I'm going to start with this image here. So before we take it over into Photoshop, I'm going to do a bit of a crop. We're going to try to fill the frame as much as we can with the action, with the interest. And I want to try to compose, with the eagle moving left through the frame, I want the head to be more towards the center of the frame. That way we have some kind of leading space there. So I'm going to bring this right edge in. And you can see, like in a lot of landscape photography, we're using the entire frame. In a lot of wildlife photography, you end up having to crop. We're going to do this first. The other thing that you have to really consider with most wildlife photography is the noise. Now, this one, I was shooting at ISO 2000. As we zoom in, you can see the noise really isn't bad at all, especially considering we can darken this down a little bit. And as we do that, the noise gets even darker. But one of the main things that we can do to reduce noise, in a high ISO image like this is to adjust our sharpening. So when we go down to the detail tab, we have our sharpening section. And if I hold down Alt or Option and slide the masking slider around, you can see how much the current sharpening algorithm is sharpening the noise in that sky. And as I slide this to the right, we'll get to a point where it's no longer sharpening the noise in the sky. It's only sharpening the details in our eagle. And that's exactly what we want. So if we look at the noise pattern here, which I know doesn't come across well on YouTube, we have this level of sharpening versus this level of sharpening. If I boost this up so you can see it a little better, we have this masking setting versus this masking setting. Look at the difference in that sky. The difference is that the noise is not being sharpened. So that's really an important step anytime you're doing a high ISO image in wildlife photography. So we're going to slide this over. I'm going to leave the detail cranked up, bring down our sharpening level, and decrease the radius so it's a small fine grain sharpening. Also, I'm going to dual process this image much like I would a landscape image. So I want to process this for the first time. I can do that in either Adobe Camera Raw or I can do it here in Lightroom before we open it up. For now, I'm going to go ahead and cool down this image. Maybe add just the tiniest bit more magenta so we get that kind of very cobalty blue background. And let's go ahead and decrease the clarity and the texture of that background. So this is only going to be for our background for this particular image. At this point, we're going to right click, edit in, open as a smart object in Photoshop. We're opening it up as a smart object. That way we can re-access that raw file, process it once for our eagle and once for our background. Okay, so we have our smart object open here inside of Photoshop. You can see that we're starting from a very kind of dark, cold place. And what I want to do to make our eagle really stand out is to brighten it and to warm it up a little bit. That way the eye is always going to be drawn to warmth and contrast and highlights. And if all of our warmth, contrast, and highlights lies within the main subject of our image, the eye is going to be automatically drawn to it. So what we're going to do is we're going to right click on the title of this layer, and we're going to go up to New Smart Object via Copy. This creates a unlinked copy of this Smart Object layer. That way we can re-access it. Now we can double click on it, and we're going to process it in Adobe Camera Raw with only our eagle in mind. So in this case, I'm going to warm it up a bit. Nothing too crazy, but just get it a little bit more neutral. I'm going to open the shadows a bit, which will help with the shadow detail, maybe increase exposure just a little bit. I'm going to also recover highlights. That way the highlights on the top of his head don't get too bright, because these are going to be close to blowing out. So I'm going to recover those highlights, lift the shadows a bit, increase exposure a bit, and then we're going to add the texture and clarity back up to close to 0 here. And then I'm going to hit OK. So you can see the difference between these two layers is not extreme. And we don't want it to be extreme, because if it's extreme, it's going to be really obvious and noticeable. We want it to be subtle but impactful. And that's kind of what I'm always striving for. Don't always achieve it, but that's what I'm always trying for. I'm going to double click our bottom layer here. Remember, this is going to be for our background. And what I want to do here is actually remove all the sharpening, because this is only going to go in the background. And I'm going to add a little noise reduction. That's going to just help mellow out that noise in the background. So we're going to go down to the detail tab, remove the sharpening, add a little noise reduction, hit OK. So the next thing that we're going to do is we're going to make a selection of our eagle. Now, a lot of you are going to be asking, can I do this in Lightroom? And yeah, you kind of can. The thing is, in Lightroom, you don't have a way of really refining any mask that you create with any level of control like you do in Photoshop. Let me show you what I'm talking about. So if I go up to Select, Subject, it's going to make a quick selection of our eagle. And sometimes this selection is quite good. Sometimes not so much. So before I make a layer mask of this layer, which is going to cut out our eagle and make it to where only the eagle is shining through on this top layer, I'm going to go to the Select and Mask section, and I'm going to refine the edge. If we zoom in here, you can see that this edge is jagged and it's imperfect. And this selection is even better than it would be in Lightroom. So you can imagine all of the artifacts that you can introduce if you just use these selections willy-nilly. You really don't want to do that. What you want to do is go up to our Refine Edge tool, make it nice and small, and then we're going to go around the edge of our eagle here. So you can see areas like this where it wasn't quite right. It was close, but it wasn't quite right. You have to remember that that selection that it created is just a quick selection. It's never meant to be like absolutely perfect. It's just trying to quickly cut out the subject or the sky or whatever it happens to be. And it's never going to be good enough. You can see all of that area of the sky that was included in this selection in the tail feathers. We're going to want to make sure that we are selecting that, and we're removing that from this subject selection. A critical part in any workflow where you're trying to make a good selection of something is to go in with a Refine Edge tool and make sure that you are doing a good job and you have a good selection of your subject. If you're doing a very, very minor adjustment, it's not as critical, but the better your selection is, the more professional the result will be. The better the result will be, the better your selection is. So taking the extra time to do this step is important. So now we've made this selection. I will add one thing. Up here we have this Refine Hair button. And if we were dealing with like a bear or an animal that has fur, that Refine Hair tool is going to work a little bit better than this Refine Edge tool. So keep that in mind. In fact, this Refine Hair tool might have worked pretty well on some of these feather areas. Once I'm done, I'm going to hit OK. So now we still have our marching ants, which tells us that we have this active selection. With this selection active, I'm just going to make sure our top layer is selected and hit New Layer Mask. Boom. And what that's done is it's cut the eagle out from the background, and we can start to get a feel for what our two layers look like when they're blended together. Now, at this point, we can kind of we can tweak things a little bit. So for example, if we wanted to see what it would look like if we darkened that background just a little bit, Maybe we could darken it and decrease some of the highlights to make that snowy area less obvious. We can double click on our smart object layer. Another benefit of opening it up as a smart object is we can continue to reaccess it. And let's go ahead and recover highlights. And you can see how much that is decreasing the contrast back there. Let's decrease whites and maybe just bring down exposure just a bit more. And then we'll hit OK. And now we can see whether we still feel like that is blending well. I feel like it's blended pretty well, although our bird is starting to look a little bit too bright, or it's standing out a bit too much. So there's a couple ways that we could deal with that. We could go back to our smart object layer and brighten it up, or we can play with our layer mask here. So if I double click on the layer mask of this top layer here, I can decrease the density. And what that does is if I hold down Alt or Option and click on this, so we can see what our layer mask looks like. As I bring down the density, you can see that it doesn't allow that black to go all the way to black. So essentially what that's going to do is allow this layer to be seen a little bit in those areas that are masked out. So I can slide this around to a point where we get to an area where our blend looks good and believable. So I think that puts us in a good spot where our subject is really bouncing off of the image. It's really standing out. We have that nice color contrast between the warmth on the eagle wings and on the beak and that cold background. And our eye goes, it's really isolating the subject. One thing I am going to do, though, is I want to make our tail stand out just a little bit less by darkening it just a tiny bit. So I'm going to create a new adjustment layer, a new brightness contrast adjustment layer. And we're going to hold down Alt and click on the line between these two layers. That's going to pin this to our bird. So essentially, this adjustment is only going to affect our eagle. But what I want to do is we only want to darken this tail feather. So I'm going to bring down the exposure a little bit. And then I'm going to click on the layer mask and hit Control-Command-I to invert it. And now I can grab a white paintbrush, 60% opacity, and just do a little pass here. And this layer mask is essentially allowing me to darken anything that I feel needs darkened. And because it's pinned to this top layer, it's only going to darken our bird. It's going to leave that background alone. So before, after, it stands out a little bit less, looks a little bit more believable, allows the eye to go to our bird first. The next thing I want to do is move on to the next step, which I feel would be dodging and burning. So what I want to do is create a new dodge burn layer. I'm going to create a new layer, change the blend mode to soft light. I'm going to select kind of this warm tone that is happening in these wings, in those highlights. So basically it's kind of an orangey yellow color. Going to brighten it, make sure it's not too saturated, maybe somewhere in here, hit OK. Now the thing is, wherever I paint this, it's going to work in brightness, and it's also going to work in that color. And if I just paint it over stuff blindly, you can see that it's also going to spill over into the shadows as well as our background, and that's going to look really fake and phony. So we're not going to do that. What I want to do is I want to create a stencil for myself. I'm going to do that by creating a luminosity mask that's going to target warmth, or target the warmer tones, and not target or not allow my paint to go into the darker or the cold tones. So I can use either TK Actions or Lumenzia. These are luminosity mask creation tools. And in this case, I'm going to show you guys Lumenzia. So if I go to Lumenzia, I can click on lights. This first button is a lights one, right? And down here, it gives me these different ways of modifying this luminosity mask. What I want to do is I want to make a selection that is targeting the brighter tones and the warmer tones, but deselecting or not selecting the colder tones. So it's already selecting the brighter tones. You can tell because it's black and white. But down here on this color conversion layer, I can double click that, and I can make it select the blue tones less, along with the magentas, but I can make it select the yellows and the reds more. And you see now all those colder tones have gone very dark and very black, but the warmer tones are very much selected. That's going to function like a stencil and allow my paint to go into the bright areas of this preview and keep my paint out of the dark areas, which is perfect for us. So I'm going to go back to Lumenzia and I'm going to hit select. That's going to load this as an active selection. You can tell because we have marching ants. I'm going to hide those marching ants by going Control or Command H. I'm going to grab my paintbrush. Let's go 40% opacity because we have a pretty restrictive selection. And now with our paintbrush, I'm just going to go in here and hit some of the areas that are already bright and already warm and just kind of emphasize them. All we're doing here, we're not trying to fake any light. We're just trying to emphasize light that's already happening. So I'm going to emphasize some of these details on his chest because they're kind of getting lost because they're in the shadow. Some of these feather details. Be thoughtful about where you're adding this stuff because you're really going to change the look of the bird, and you don't want, and that's kind of the difference between landscape photography and wildlife photography, is you're not trying to alter or change what you're photographing so much in wildlife photography. You're just trying to draw attention to things rather than change them. So I'm just trying to emphasize light here. I'm not trying to do anything crazy. I just want to add a little bit of extra dimension. So before, after, before, after. It's not a massive change, but it is a change, and it is an impactful one because we're not only adding a little brightness, but we're also adding that bit of warmth. And that bit of warmth is really helping the whole color contrast idea that we have between that cold background and our warm eagle. Next thing I want to do is I want to add a little bit of contrast in the feather detail. And a lot of these feather details, especially in the head, they're all up in the highlights. So what I want to do is add contrast to the highlights. So what I'm going to do is let's grab a lights 1. We're going to attach a levels adjustment to that. So we have a contrast adjustment with this as its layer mask, which means that it's going to go much more into the highlights and pretty much stay out of the shadows. So I'm going to double click that levels adjustment, drag this right slider to the left, grab the midtone slider and take it to the right. And this is where we're going to see a pretty big change. Before, after. It's darkening those highlights, but it's doing it in a way to where we're increasing the texture and the dimension that we see in those highlights. Next thing I want to do is emphasize the catch light. So I'm going to create a new dodge burn layer, only this time I'm going to leave it on overlay. And we're going to zoom in and add just a little bit of light around the catch light in the eye. There was just this tiniest little bit of sun poking out when this was taken. And I want to emphasize that catch light. Catch lights are really important with any portrait, really. You know, you're photographing a person, the catch lights are important. Same is true with wildlife. A lot of times with wildlife, though, if you don't have that light in the eye, it just looks lifeless. A lot of times with wildlife photography, if you don't have a catch light in the eye tends to look a little bit lifeless and almost fake. So I find that you can take a catch light like this and emphasize it. So we're going to zoom in and just do a couple clicks like this, zoom back out, before, after. Zoom in a little bit, before, after. Just emphasizing that catch light will really help bring just a little bit of life into that eye. Before, after. Next thing I like to do on all of my photography, including wildlife photography, is throw a little Orton effect on it. So I'm going to do that by creating a merge visible layer, Control-Shift-Alt-E or Command-Option-Shift-E on a Mac. That gives us this layer here. It's basically a stamped version of our photo on its own pixel layer. Then we can go up to Filter, Blur, Gaussian Blur. We're going to blur this somewhere around 40 some pixels. I'm going to decrease the opacity of this down to like a 22%, 25%. That's fine. I'm going to go to TK Actions, which is another luminosity mask creation tool. And we're just going to throw a light swan luminosity mask on this layer. That's going to restrict this Orton effect to go only into the highlights and not into the shadows. So that gives us one more opportunity to create more color separation by going up to our camera raw filter. And in our camera raw filter, we're going to add contrast, add a bit of exposure, and add a bit of warmth. And because it's really going to stay out of those shadow areas, and this is going to primarily be for the highlights, it's going to not warm up the cold tones. It's only going to warm up the shadow areas. So before, after, I just find it's a really nice way of mellowing out harsh details and giving it just a sense of atmosphere. I'm going to decrease the opacity of this down to about a 20%. So the other thing that I'll do oftentimes with other images, not necessarily this one, but we'll run it through this one anyways, is I'm going to create a merged visible layer. Then I'm going to go up to filter, and I'm going to run this through Topaz Photo AI. So Topaz has Topaz Denoise, Topaz Gigapixel, and Topaz Sharpen. And if you already have all three of those, it gives you Topaz Photo AI, which is essentially all three of them in one panel. When we put this into Topaz Photo AI, we can remove noise, we can sharpen, and we can also enhance resolution. Most of the time, I only do noise reduction. And you can see that when you first import it, it gives you some recommended settings. It also detects the subject. So you can see that when I hover over this, it's going to do things like remove noise from the background, but not too much from the subject. It's going to sharpen the subject, but not the background. So when I move this back and forth, this line here, you can see this is before. Notice the sharpness and detail around the eye and the beak, and after. And look at how much sharper and clearer that is. Also notice that the noise has been reduced. So look at the noise kind of in these areas. The noise is also being reduced. So honestly, with my landscape photography, I didn't really use it all that much. I owned it and never used it. But now that I'm shooting more wildlife photography, the Topaz products are pretty damn awesome. I can also go down to the enhanced resolution. And what that's going to do is try to add more detail than is there. So if you've had to crop a lot in a wildlife image, this will often give you some details that you maybe didn't even have to begin with. So this is before and this is after. And the amount of sharpness that you gain here without it looking like sharpening, that's the impressive thing, is pretty amazing. So hopefully this has been interesting to you guys. That's my workflow for wildlife photography. Here's the final result. Really happy with the way that we have that contrasting warm to cool tone color contrast idea, and the way that the eagle really stands out from the background. I really love that. So hopefully this has been useful to you guys. We'll see you in the next video. Take it easy, everybody.